I think he's created the most amazing political comeback in American history. The 16 states that tried to take him off the ballot in the first, the 2 impeachments, the trial as a private citizen, and then, of course, the 2 assassination attempts. So to be able to overcome all of that and then wage a campaign in which he was outspent 2.5 to 1, and yet he overcame all of that. So it was an amazing achievement.
Donald Trump was announced as Times Person of the Year. Are we living in the Trump era?
Well, we're certainly living in a counter-revolutionary era, and I think you could put his name to it. What's fascinating, unlike 2016 election, 2020, is that partly because he won the popular vote, first time a Republican had done that in 20 years, but also he ran everybody acknowledges on both sides that he ran a much better campaign. He was much more focused. His social media was more directed, succinct, and he had a much better campaign, not just than his own campaigns, but better than the opposition. You put all that together, and there's a sense that we're in a new era. And what do I mean by that? There's a sense now that Joe Biden, who is going to leave in 40 days at 36% approval this week, and he hasn't been on the job. Kamala Harris hasn't been on the job. No one knows who's on the job. And Donald Trump is de facto president, even though the left had said, in the case of Michael Flynn and others in transitions, that they would invoke the Logan Act, an archaic, ossifate idea that no one's ever used, that a president you cannot interfere with a presidential prerogative if you're a president-elect team or a shadow government. But that's exactly what he's doing, and it's almost as if the left are saying to him, we're out of ideas, we're out of operations, we don't know what we did, we all understand people don't like us, the border's a mess, crime's a mess, the economy's a mess, please take over, we're done. I've never seen anything like it.
You're an historian. Do you view Donald Trump as a great man of history?
I do. I think he's created the most amazing political comeback in American history, much greater than Harry Truman's 1948 election, much greater than a remarkable comeback by Richard Nixon after his 1962 gubernatorial defeat in California. He came back and became president, and much greater than sort of midterm recoveries of people like Obama and Clinton, who had been shellacked in the midterms. No, it's amazing. It's amazing because it wasn't just a political recovery. It was a psychological, legal, cultural recovery. If we had this conversation, and we did, we were talking a year or two ago about the 5 civil and criminal suits, the 16 states that tried to take him off the ballot in the first, the 2 impeachments, the trial as a private citizen. They did, and then, of course, the 2 assassination attempts. So to be able to overcome all of that and then wage a campaign in which he was outspent 2.5 to 1, if you count the PAC money, and he had 95% negative coverage in the media, and yet he overcame all of that. So it was an amazing achievement.
How does Trump's victory compare to previous populist movements in American history? I'm thinking of people like Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, even George Wallace.
Well, the closest, the precursor is the 2 efforts in that one of them destroyed the George H.W. Bush re-election in 92, but the Ross Perot in 92 and 96, he got 20% of the vote. That was the highest ever of a populist movement, the Perot movement. And there were Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot precursors in the Donald Trump populism, in the sense that we're spending money on optional military engagements abroad, and we're allowing our middle class to be devastated in the Rust Belt, and of course through illegal immigration. But what was interesting about this cultural revolution, I should say counter-revolution, was he was able, as we've spoken before, to appeal to people on shared class concerns, and that meant that for the first time in history, a Republican candidate probably got somewhere between 25 and 30% of the African-American male vote, and probably 45% of the Hispanic vote and probably 55% of Hispanic males. And that's just unheard of. And he did that by showmanship and substance. Showmanship by getting in a garbage truck, working at McDonald's, showing up in union jobs after he was on, getting a mugshot, being one of the people, and then a program that said from a Republican, I've never seen a Republican say, we're not going to privatize Social Security, we're not going to touch it, we're going to have reciprocal trade tariffs on people who take advantage of us. And then he was ecumenical, and so he brought people in from the proverbial left that had been renegade left, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, people like that. And that was more valuable to him than the Harris mimicry of it when she tried to bring in somebody like Liz Cheney, the never Trump Republicans. They were bitter, angry people. And they went to the left and helped Harris because they were angry that their career ambitions and agendas had been thwarted, or they had exhausted their vocabulary of Trump as Hitler. But the other people weren't. RFK and Tulsi and some of the Democrats in Silicon Valley that supported Trump were upbeat, and they said, we're supporting him because he's going to deregulate and cut taxes and try to cut government, and he's enlisting former people of the left like Elon Musk and these exciting entrepreneurs. And there was a sense that anything is possible, where in the case of Harris, she was always telling us what we can't do. You can't do this, you can't have a gas stove, you can't drive, you can't frack, until her metamorphosis, at least, of 100 days where she kind of bounced around on those issues. But he said, we're going to do it. We can do all of this thing. So it was a very optimistic, can-do, Reagan-esque type message.
From a cultural perspective, do you think Trump has gone from being a dissident to the mainstream? You see a lot of people doing his famous dance, sports stars and all of this, and this has been used as evidence by the New York Times today that Trump is no longer this outsider, he is the mainstream.
Yeah, I saw that. I think they have it wrong. I think the mainstream came to him. He didn't go to the mainstream. He's the outsider, and the mainstreams have become the outsiders. When you walk into Madison Square Garden and you get a standing ovation, and you look at the menagerie that's with him, I mean, I have never in American history, I can't think of more diverse characters. There was Joe Rogan, there was Dana White, there was Hulk Hogan, there was RFK, there was Tulsi Gabbard, there was Speaker Johnson of the House, and they were all there, and they all were there for particular reasons that they had more in common, and that was kind of the new establishment. And so when you look at his cabinet picks, the new establishment of a Kash Patel or Pete Hegseth or Jay Bhattacharya is, we have all been damaged by this uniparty Washington, New York nexus, and we're uniquely suitable because we know what it's like to have the FBI go after us, or the NIH go after us, or the DOD go after us, and we're going to change. And that is the establishment now, and that's why all these people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Senator Fetterman are saying, you know what? All that stuff that we kind of bought into about Trump being a fascist or Hitler, that was just rhetoric. We know he's not. And we know that this country was headed in the wrong direction. And even though we're people of the left, we're not going to play this charade anymore.
Is wokeism dying? I know Trump isn't president yet, but it looks like Walmart is scrapping its DEI initiatives and all these companies are going towards the Trump direction.
Yeah, I don't think it's just the end of the beginning. I think in a Churchillian sense it's the beginning of the end, because you're starting to see the dominoes start to hit one another in the corporate world. And the reason why it's so easy to do that is when people are talking about cutting and being efficient, Elon Musk or Ramaswamy, then these corporations look around and they think, we have hired all these people. They've only been here 4 years, but they're commissars and they produce nothing. But they do cause problems of not just omission, but commission. They retard people. They get in the way of productive people. They monitor people. They monitor thought. So to get rid of them is not only a great boon financially, but it empowers people whom they were monitoring. So it was easy to get rid of them as a first step. The harder part will be in the universities and Hollywood, professional sports. But even there, Donald Trump had people who took the knee and were not saluting the flag with the BLM movement, and now they're doing YMCA dances. Same people. So I think we're in a true cultural counter revolution, or maybe a reformation, or some counter reformation.
How do you think history would have been different if Trump had died in that assassination attempt in July?
Well, I think J.D. Vance surprised everybody that the status quo opinion was that he was a white male like Trump, and he was from Ohio that was already in the red state win bracket, so he brought nothing to the ticket. He turned out to be a marvelous debater. He destroyed the media every time he talked to them. He destroyed Tim Walz. He was kind. He was soft. But I don't think he would have been able to defeat Kamala Harris. He didn't have the ability to bring out all of these diverse people. And so had Donald Trump been shot and killed, I think we would have had Harris. And what would have happened, all of those 100-day metamorphoses, I'm for fracking, that would just dissipate it, evaporated, and she would have reverted to form. And as we've already had 2.7 inflation just this month. And so I think it would have been printing more money, more DEI, more pouring money into Ukraine, more telling Israel you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, and more DEI. It would have been a disaster. I don't think the country at $37 trillion in debt and disunited and angry, I just don't, there was no effort to address 83 million people not born in the United States, 25 to 30 million illegal aliens, people coming in at 10,000 people a day. That's what they wanted. It was a nihilistic agenda, and I think that's one of the reasons that Donald Trump won. But I don't think the anger at that agenda alone would have allowed J.D. Vance to do so well.
It's been more than a month since the election. Do you think the Democrats have begun to learn the lessons from their defeat, the right lessons?
Not yet. I think they have to lose the midterms. Their answer so far is always transactional. They always think that we have the right message, but maybe she should have had that interview with Joe Rogan, or maybe we shouldn't have paid Oprah money, or maybe we could have got Cardi B and Al Sharpton for free, or maybe we just didn't go down to the border quick enough. They're always trying to find things, or we really didn't play the Donald Trump dictator card hard enough. And I haven't seen anybody who says we are a party of elites and subsidized poor, and our strength is the bi-coastal elite in the universities along the coastal strips, Hollywood entertainment, professional sports, corporate boardroom, Silicon Valley, and then poor people in the major cities, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia. And we have lost everybody else because we don't reflect any interest or empathy for the middle classes. And I just don't think they're going to change because they're not interested. You can see that with the hurricane and the damage. People, we still have poor white people in the Carolinas and Georgia that don't have heat or don't have shelter. We saw that with East Palestine, and they're just open about it. Biden doesn't care. And so there was this idea that if you're the FBI, you go after anti-abortion, pro-life people. You go after parents at school board meetings. You go after traditional Catholics. And they were going to continue to do that. And I think the same thing with the military. The military is going to have DI. It was going to have trans dances. It was going to try to go after the white males, even though they knew they had lost 45,000 recruits and they were short. They were going to. They didn't feel like they had to stop. As long as they had left-wing people in power, they would make the necessary adjustment. Now, they want to know why they lost, and they think they lost. Well, maybe we didn't quite make enough money. You tell them you had 2.5 times the money. Well, maybe if we had 3. Well, maybe if she'd been on MSNBC, you say that you have 95% of the coverage. That was what all, and you have about 90% of the TV audience. And then they said, well, maybe we didn't get that the Obamas didn't come out. All the polls show that people got sick of the Obamas. They came out too much. But they're searching for answers in lieu of a existential reappraisal. If they were smart, they would say, we're going to go back to the Bill Clinton correction of 1992, and we're going to go back and say, the George McGovern, Jimmy Carter Democratic Party doesn't work. But that took 20 years, if you look from 1972 to 1992.
I don't know if you saw the Pod Save America interview with Kamala's campaign staffers, but they essentially said for more than an hour that they basically won the campaign. If you look at the swing states, they didn't swing quite as much towards Trump as the rest of the country. So they were campaigning in those swing states, they ignored everywhere else, and they did very well in the swing states. They just couldn't quite get it over the line. And what they blamed was the national political situation. And they said, essentially people were upset with Joe Biden, the economy, and they had no chance of winning this election. They ran the perfect campaign for Kamala. They didn't make any mistakes. And the only problem was the political situation. What do you make of that?
No, because they had created a coup in 2020 to put Joe Biden in power. They knew he was demented. And they had forced out Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and at that point, Joe Biden had lost all of the first three caucuses and primaries. So he was put in there as a receptacle, a facade, a puppet for a hard left agenda. And they used old Joe Biden. And then they did something that they did not tell the voters. They put him in the basement under the guise of COVID. They said they were going to have a centrist unifying campaign in reaction to the chaos of Trump. They came in, and then they went hard to the left. Barack Obama had said earlier, when asked, would you like a third term? He said, only if I could call it in and I had an earpiece of some surrogate that would take orders from me. He said that. And so they ran hard to the left. And then when that proved unsuitable, both because the message on every one of these issues, 60% wanted the border closed, 58% wanted people deported, 70% said the economy was in the wrong direction, 68% said crime was terrible, 65% wanted more energy production. Almost 70% said Afghanistan was a disaster. 55% now don't support the Ukraine policies. So they didn't have the issues. And then when they removed him in the same anti-democratic backroom manner in which they elected him, they nullified 14 million primary voters, the wishes. And then then their last chance, I see it, to have won was to have had an open convention and get candidates, Amy Klobuchar, Josh Shapiro, people like that would at least feign that they were moderates, and they didn't do that. They just had a kind of another coup and put her in there, and then she didn't talk to anybody for 6 weeks. She avoided all town halls, all interviews, all press. She never gave a press conference, and when they said they ran a perfect campaign, by the 6th week the joy was all over with. And they know, the people that were on that podcast know, their internal polls showed that she was never ahead. And they kept telling everybody she had a joy campaign, a momentum campaign, even though the public polls, the ones that were reliable, Inside Advantage, Atlas, Trafalgar, Rasmussen, were always showing Donald Trump ahead. But their polls, New York Times, Washington Post, showed that she was gaining ground, but their own campaign would say later, post facto, we don't know where they got that data, because I know maybe they were trying to help us, but we understood she was never ahead. And so once people got to see her and hear her, the more they saw and heard her, the more they didn't want her. Now, when they say we came within 1.5 points of the popular vote, or we could have almost won some swing states, we lost them, 2 or 3 points. What they don't tell you is that in every single major issue, Donald Trump enjoyed margins of 15 to 20%, and that they were running against a candidate in which, as I said earlier, they had 95% of the media positive coverage, and they had about 2.5 times more money than he did, and they had really injured him by putting him on trial and trying to get him off the ballot. He had spent enormous amounts of money. He spent over $1 billion on fines, on legal costs, and efforts to get back on the ballot and stay out of jail. And with all of that, he still won the popular and electoral college vote. So they know that, and they don't know what to say about it. It's almost as if, like they said, well, can somebody shoot him? Can somebody impeach him? Can somebody get him off the ballot? Can somebody bankrupt him with a civil sexual harassment? Can we get a federal suit to put him in jail? Can we raid his home? Can we get Fannie Willis to make up a crime about calling the registrar? How about Letitia James finding him $370 million maybe for real estate overvaluations? We'll get Alvin Bragg on the rank. Maybe we'll send our third guy from the DOJ to help out Bragg to, gin up a federal offense that no one in the feds ever wanted to charge him with, but we'll bootstrap it on. And that was their attitude. It still didn't work.
Let's talk about the transition period. Do you feel that Trump's enemies are already having some successes? For example, Matt Gaetz is probably the biggest loss of the Trump/MAGA crowd so far. Obviously, he was nominated to be the Attorney General. He's had to drop out, presumably because he didn't have enough support in the Senate. Pete Hegseth as well has come under a lot of pressure also to drop out. People talking about putting Ron DeSantis in there, for example, as the Defense Secretary. Do you feel that Trump's enemies are already winning?
No, I don't. I think from the people I've talked to yesterday and the day before, it's pretty clear to me that Pete Hegseth will be confirmed, and RFK will be confirmed, and Kash Patel will be confirmed, and Jay Bhattacharya will be confirmed. There'll be a bigger fight with Tulsi Gabbard. I'm not sure about that. The problem with Matt Gaetz was there were other agendas at work besides just his nomination for the Attorney General. And there's a lot of theories that he was facing a devastating release of an internal audit by the House. He didn't want to do that, so he resigned. He didn't have to resign his House seat until he was confirmed, but he did so. And that squashed the release of that. And then if you look at his credentials vis-a-vis Pam Bondi, she had been a long Attorney General of Florida. She tried case. He had never tried a case as a federal or state prosecutor. So he didn't have the same fides that she did in experience. And so then the question is, why did he nominate him? A lot of people had argued that he was such a controversial figure and that Kevin McCarthy was spending money to stop him, and that he had done so much damage to Kevin McCarthy and the status quo in the House that maybe he would draw in almost like a decoy or a detour off the path, and then they would kind of exhaust themselves. Well, we stopped the hated Matt Gaetz. Man, we hate that guy. We can congratulate her. And then while they were doing that, they were going to push them in. Sounds very elaborate and unlikely, but results are starting to confirm that's exactly what's happening. They have lost all their enthusiasm or power or momentum to stop these. And they really went after Gaetz, but I think they've given up this week on Kash Patel, and they've given up on Hegseth.
Overall, how do you assess the transition period so far? Do you like the nominations? Do you think they're radical enough? Someone like Marco Rubio, maybe he's more from the old guard Republican, establishment. Some people would argue that. Others would say he's a MAGA supporter all the way. So how do you assess his cabinet picks, his transition period?
I think they're very good. Marco Rubio, as you know, has had a remarkable metamorphosis, say, from 2021 to 2024. So if you look at what he's been saying in the Senate, and he has been very, very critical of the blank check in Ukraine. His whole idea is where he would differ from, say, a Rand Paul he would say, Well, we inherited a mess, so we'll still fund them only because we have to get leverage on Putin. If we pull out, it'll look like Afghanistan. We'll get blamed. It's a tactical difference. It's not a philosophical difference. So I think he's pretty good. The people all have one thing in common. I mean, if you look at Jay Bhattacharya, NIH, RFK, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, I could go on. They were all targets of the agencies in which they're asked to run, and that gives them a special zeal. So they monitored Kash Patel, the FBI did, and when Pete Hegseth wrote The War on Warriors, people in the DOD went after him. The HHS has tried to make RFK's life miserable for a decade, and Jay Bhattacharya, he was denied NIH grants. He was censored by the faculty of the medical and the general faculty of the university I'm speaking from right now at Stanford. So they have a kind of a zeal, because they said if they did this to me with my stature, they'll do it to anybody. And so we're going to stop that. So I'm really pleased with all. There's a few that I would disagree with. The Secretary of Labor, I think she's, I don't know, we would call her in the United States a rhino at best, but that was a gift to the unions that voted, the Teamster unions and people like that voted for Trump. Usually the Secretary of Labor is not an important post in the United States. It's like the Secretary of Commerce or something. But all of them are pretty good, and they pretty much, there's some controversial ones on the ambassadorial level, but that happens. I mean, Kimberly Gorfield, the ex-girlfriend of Don Jr., is now, and I have a soft spot because I lived in Greece 3 years, but she does not have expertise in Greece. Jared Kushner's father, ambassador to France. But again, if you look at the totality, Donald Trump is saying to the nation, I only have 4 years, and I cannot afford to fight with Jim Mattis and John Kelly and Rex Tillerson and Anonymous and John Bolton and all these deep state instigators. So I'm getting rid of all of them. And he's going to have the largest mass firings of political appointees. I think there'll be 15 or 20,000 of them. And I don't think he will even replace them all. And then he's getting people in there so that when the DOD calls state up, they're not going to say, hey, did crazy Trump issue an order? How do we get together and stop it? They're going to say, I'm going to do this to help the Trump agenda. What do you want to do? How do you want to? And that's going to be a much bigger difference. Everybody is on the same page, where Trump came in baffled and was given a bunch of grandee names and said, if you're a Republican, this is the pool. And he had never really, he picked these people, and almost immediately they said, to retain our careers, our prestige, so we're still viable for the next 20 years, we have to stay in government with the Republican president, but we have to undermine him so we can say we're not of Trump, we just serve with him. But we're going to stop him, and then we're going to all leak to the press and say, you have no idea what I did to save the United States, this crazy Trump. That was the modus operandi of the whole first 4 years.
You mentioned Kash Patel. I want to talk a bit about the FBI. How do you assess the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover? Can you talk a bit about who Kash Patel is? And can you talk as well about Christopher Wray and his legacy at the FBI?
We have to remember that under the Nixon administration in the 70s, the half-century reign of J. Edgar Hoover, who had been the only director, he had been the creator of the FBI, and he had been very famous for breaking up the crime waves during Prohibition in the big cities and the mafia. And he had been very good in World War II finding there actually were German spies and sympathetic people. But in the 1950s and 60s, when he got into the civil rights and communist movements, then he used extra legal efforts. He tapped people without warrants, for example, or the FBI would send tapes that were incriminating about a private escapade or affair to particular civil rights leaders. That's documented. So then we went into a period of reform during the next 30 years. Christopher Wray and James Comey and Andrew McCabe and I think you can even say Robert Mueller, they began to revert back to the mindset of J. Edgar Hoover. In other words, they had much more power than J. Edgar Hoover. They were much larger, and they had much more prerogatives and agendas. So what they started to do was they became, it was funny what happened. They tried to pick people nominally Republican, but were actually very left-wing and supportive of the left. So James Comey, he basically lied to the president, said he wasn't under investigation, memorialized a confidential conversation with the president, leaked it, went before the House Intelligence Committee, lied 245 times under oath by saying he couldn't remember, hired Christopher Steele. He was an FBI informant whose main job was to destroy the Trump campaign. And then we went right into Andrew McCabe, lied 4 times to federal investigators. He was the one referenced by Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, because Andrew said, don't worry, he can't win. Trump will not win this election. And he was involved heavily with the Christopher Steele dissemination. Then we had Christopher Wray, and he was supposed to be the reform and stop this J. Edgar Hooverism that had been this recrudescence. And what did he do? The laptop comes up. It's obviously Hunter's. The guy calls the FBI and said, "This is the most incriminating thing I've said." Luckily, he kept a copy. And he said, "It's mine now," because after 30 days legally he abandoned it. But here it is. FBI examined it and it said it's obviously Hunter's. And then they suppressed it for a year. Meanwhile, they leaked it that it might be Russian disinformation. Anthony Blinken called up 51. And by the way, they were not retired intelligence authorities. At least a third of them still had contractual arrangements with the CIA and FBI. And they started to say, on the eve of election, this has got all the hallmarks of Russian information or disinformation. And then they partnered with social media. So we had FBI agents going to the old Twitter and Facebook and then monitoring which news stories, many from the Murdoch papers, that were injurious to Joe Biden, and then suppressing them under the idea that this was spreading Russian disinformation. And the weird thing about that was then they were rotating into these social media. It was almost they had copied the Pentagon corruption of a general then going into a defense contractor and using his former subordinates to buy weapons that may not have been what the nation needed. And what they were doing, you take one guy like James Baker, was the general counsel for the FBI, making about $200,000 a year. He's working to suppress news. Then he retires, goes to work for Twitter and gets $7 million as Twitter's a year for Twitter's general counsel. That's the stuff the FBI was. They went after traditional Catholics under Christopher Wray. They went after pro-life protesters in an asymmetrical fashion. They raided a pro-life protester. Had done nothing wrong. The SWAT team came to his home, father of 7. They went after Donald Trump. They used 30 agents that were armed. We've never had that happen. Swept down on Mar-a-Lago for a dispute over an archive. Papers that had been there 2 years, not 30 like Joe Biden's, much more secure than his garage. And then we saw that in addition to all of that, they went after parents at school board meetings because on the prompt of the teachers' unions. And so it was an utterly corrupt, rogue operation. And now they're furious because Kash Patel is going to do 2 or 3 things. The first thing he wants to do is move that agency physically to the center of the country, where it'll be much more strategically located, but you won't have the incestuous power couples. Comey's wife this, Andrew McCabe's spouse that, a Lisa Page, a Peter. So you're going to get them out of the media political nexus. The second thing is he's going to bring in a lot of the old hand FBI people who retired or resigned over what they saw, and they're all stridently angry, and I think they'll give him the expertise to reboot the FBI. And the third thing that are going to prompt all the Democrats to vote against him is he's going to start releasing files in his possession, and the files about Crossfire Hurricane, the effort to destroy Donald Trump, the files about what Anthony Blinken was doing, rounding up the intelligence authorities, what Jake Sullivan was doing about getting the FBI to investigate a supposed ping of the Alpha Bank communications with Trump Tower. So they have a lot of people. There's a lot of people very worried. And he's not going to be opposed by the CIA under John Ratcliffe or DEI. They're going to be helping him do this. So I think that's why the left is very terrified. They're afraid that this is why if somebody offered you or me a blanket pardon for the last 10 years, and we know we hadn't done anything wrong, we wouldn't take the pardon, even if it was one of our enemies. But they're all considering this. They all want these pardons because they know they have criminal exposure.
What do you make of James Angleton? We're talking about the CIA here. I want to shift slightly to foreign policy now. Can you talk about his legacy and how should the new Trump administration deal with the CIA? Because that's always been, Republicans have always kind of been a bit skeptical of the CIA, or at least MAGA Republicans have, perhaps even more so than the FBI. So can you talk a bit about the legacy of that institution and how Trump can tame the CIA?
Well, the idea of the CIA grew out of the OSS by a lot of very talented people in World War II. And after World War II and the realization that Joseph Stalin was not an ally of the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency grew up as a way of stopping the Comintern spread of communism. That was the purpose of it. And very quickly they understood the KGB was assassinating people, it was overthrowing governments, and their ideas of sort of food for peace or nuclear energy for peace was not working. So the CIA came up with the military that they were going to draw the line in certain places, Korea, Vietnam, Turkey, Greece. And as a part of that, they felt that Russia was installing communist governments under socialist fronts. So the CIA would be using the same tactics. They would start to fund anti-socialists. They would then fund right-wing people. That they coined he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. That type of realism. And then it all blew up. And so in 1972, Richard Helms, CIA, the Frank Church had these hearings, and we learned that they had tried to assassinate Fidel Castro. They were doing things that the KGB did, but they were doing it, eventually they would hope that something like South Korea would metamorphosize from the re-government they installed to elected government. Sometimes it didn't work as well. So that was it was a Cold War process where any means necessary were exempted to fight this communist monstrosity in China and Russia and the Warsaw Pact. And then that framework persisted in areas that the CIA by statute did not have authority, and that was domestic situations where they would say this person is a foreign agent or that person. And the 60s people felt that it had gone under control. Church had these hearings. We found out they were killing. So there was an idea the CIA was bad. But then what happened in the later 70s, 80s, and 90s, the CIA then reformed, and under different leaders, it was almost like the Comey FBI. It became kind of the darling of Hollywood. It had women, it had blacks, it was diverse. And the idea was that we were going to get the best and the brightest again, and they would go into the CIA and they would fight right-wing terrorism. They would go after fundamentalist jihadism, but they weren't going in and trying to overthrow or put dictators in as the last resort. That was the idea. And so the problem with this is that once you lose the media was all left controlled, and the media was the watchdog. But once the left-wing media, which was the media, there was no distinction. Once you lost that watchdog, then you get people in the CIA that we got. And they started to monitor right-wing people. They started to go, they were under John Brennan. John Brennan lied under oath to Congress and just said he did. They asked him point blank, are you monitoring is the CIA monitoring the staff computers of senators? And he said no, and then it was true. They said to John Brennan, on your targeted assassination drone strikes, we are hearing you're killing a lot of Pakistani families when we're not sure there's terror. Have you killed any? No, we have no collateral damage. And then when they threatened to put him, charge him with perjury, he then recanted and said, I'm sorry, I lied under oath. James Clapper, who was head of Director of National Intelligence in the NSA, they asked him point blank, does the NSA spy on people? Had a constitutional prohibition like the CIA of no domestic spying. He said, no, we wouldn't do that. They brought him back in and said, A, B, C, D, evidence. Now what do you say? I gave the least untruthful answer, famously, he said that. So they're completely, I think they've become rogue agencies, and I think they're going to, again, there's a lot of secrets, and I think John Radcliffe, or Tulsi Gabbard, or Kash Patel, who all get along with each other, are going to work in concert to expose a lot of this. And it's very strange because under the church hearings, it was always the right, the law and order right that was embarrassed. We had to do this to stop communism, and the left was for transparency, supposedly, especially if it embarrassed the United States. But now it's going to embarrass the left. And they're the ones that are saying this is not fair, we have to have secrecy, because they have been using this in political ways to hurt candidates.
One thing you haven't really mentioned is, talking about the legacy of both the FBI and the CIA, was the extent to which they were penetrated by communist double agents, particularly after and during the Second World War. And I know that in Britain we had the famous Cambridge Five, and this caused a huge embarrassment for the establishment and the elites and so on. So Edgar Hoover, he may have been quite fanatical, same with James Angleton, but there was a point there, wasn't there? The communists were trying and were very successful in infiltrating elite institutions.
Well, Alan Dulles and Angleton had always said they didn't really have a name for him, but it was a code for the master spy, because there were too many CIA agents getting killed, and the KGB had too many, information about American weapons. They were almost our entire nuclear plant, our ballistic missiles, our strategic submarines were popping up with Soviet. Going back to the B-29 program, the entire B-29 program was photographed and it became a Tupolev bomber. So there was this idea that it had been compromised by people in the Alger-Hiss State Department mode that thought the Soviet Union should remain an ally of the United States under the Roosevelt. It got its anti-communist flavor from Harry Truman. Harry Truman broke with the Roosevelts and said, that son of a bitch lied to me, Stalin, at Potsdam. So, yeah, I think that's true. And I think today they have a greater problem. It's not communism now or Russia, but they have people in the CIA, especially in the intelligence frameworks of the Pentagon, that are less than vigilant about Iran and about radical Islam. Many of them from the Middle East. Robert Malley should have never, ever had a security clearance. And there are people in the Pentagon we've had to look very carefully out from Iranian Americans that have clear sympathies with the Iranian government and not with the Iranian liberation forces. So that's been a big problem. And that's the equivalent of you're a McCarthyite to dare suggest that there's communists in the State Department, CIA, FBI is now you're a racist or you're a bigot to dare suggest that someone from the Middle East may not be totally committed to the United States or is passing on information.
Or you're a conspiracy theorist for saying
Yes.
that there is a deep state who's working against Trump. Okay, so two final topics before we end. I want to ask about Daniel Penny. This was a very interesting, I think, landmark moment. In recent years, his acquittal for the alleged murder or manslaughter of Jordan Neely, the homeless chap on the train in New York. He was acquitted this week. New York, incredibly liberal city. Many people were surprised that he wasn't convicted on this crime. And it looked like the prosecutor, the judge, was doing everything they could to make sure that he was convicted. What do you think this says? What do you think his acquittal says for America, for the BLM era? Does this have broader implications?
Well, unlike George Floyd, there's no riots. They said there would be riots. There's no riots. And there's no riots for two reasons. One, Donald Trump is coming into office, and this is going to be true on inauguration. He has announced, in fact, that if you're in BLM or Antifa or any organized group and you start to riot or organize across street, he's going to charge you with racketeering and conspiracy. A lot of these people, both in BLM but also in Antifa, are upper middle class people, and they do not want, felony convictions on their record. The second thing is it reflects the slow drift of minorities away from the left and Democratic Party. So when you have 25% of black males voting for Trump or 45% of Hispanics, that is reflected politically around this case in a couple of ways. Four of the jurors were not there were four of the jurors, or five of them, were not white, so-called white. You had the mayor, who was black, of New York, openly praising Daniel Penny. You had at least two key witnesses who helped subdue Mr. Neely and testified that they felt their lives were in danger. So when you make the argument, well, this person is a black victim and it's a white victimizer, then all of a sudden you've got a problem, and that is the black mayor of a minority-majority city says this man did the right thing. The people on the subway who were overwhelmingly not white said he did the right thing. Jurors said he did the right thing. And the people who were prosecuting him was a so-called white radical lawyer that Mr. Bragg had assigned. And then Mr. Bragg had a record as well, going back to the Trump weaponized indictments of no goodwill in New York. People were getting tired of him. And you put it all together, and I guess it says that we're getting very tired of this straitjacket racism. Another way to look at it is there was the black official narrative and the left-wing official narrative, and then there's a reality. And people during this trial talked about the reality. The reality is that if you look at FBI crime statistics on hate crimes, almost 45% of those who are victims now are Jews in major cities. And whites themselves are about 50 to 70% victims, a little bit higher than their proportions. But when you look at the oppressors, people of color are double their numbers of hate crime victimizers. So blacks make up about 12% of the population. They're about 25 to 30% of the victimizers in hate crimes. When you look at interracial crimes, it's only about 8% of all violent crime, but in that 8%, it's 7 times more likely that the perpetrator is black than white. And that's a devastating statistic. When you look at the final statistic of unarmed people who were shot by the police as they were taken into custody, they're double the number of whites than blacks, but more importantly, and that should be higher, I understand, because blacks are 12% of the population, but when you look at the 11 million people who are arrested and come in contact with the police, there was a lower number of unarmed black men as a percentage of the arrested than there are white men who were lethally shot. And then when you look at other high-profile cases, to finish this that people referenced in the collective memory. We had just 4 years ago Officer Byrd, a black male with a checkered record on the Capitol Police. He had been cited 4 or 5 times for infractions, leaving a loaded weapon in the Capitol bathroom. So he shoots on January 6th an unarmed 105-pound Ashley Babbitt as she's committing a misdemeanor of going through a window when she's facing heavily armed SWAT people who could have stopped her any moment and felt that she was no threat. He comes belated on the scene, shoots her in the neck, and then his identity is suppressed for about 6 months, and then he gets a raise even though he had a very poor record of service. So people say race doesn't seem to matter anymore. If you're a black officer and you execute or shoot a white woman for a misdemeanor who's unarmed, and then you're going to go after he's not a vigilante, he's an upstanding citizen, wants to preserve the safety on the subway, and he subdues it. It's so complicated now that the effort to say black, victim doesn't work. There's too many statistics that show that people of color, according to the classical paradigm of victimizer, victim, oppressor, oppressed, they are using violence more than their numbers in the population. And the people who are being victimized in crime and assault, according to their own statistics, are overrepresented as victims and underrepresented as victimizers.
And just finally, I want you to comment on reports that Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, that's that place that Trump said that they're eating the cats and dogs. There are reports that those people are leaving Springfield because they're worried about being deported under the Trump administration. Can you just comment on those reports?
It's not just them. There is a statute in the federal immigration corpus that we always have neglected, and it says if you have made an unlawful attempt to go into the United States and you have been apprehended, then you are barred for 10 years from even applying for legal statutes. So there's a lot of people who feel I'm in Springfield or I'm in El Paso and I broke the law the last 2 or 3 years and I'm going to be a big target and they're going to deport me. And then even if my sister's here or I can't apply for citizenship or a green card. So there's going to be a large number that goes well beyond Ohio and these high-profile communities where people are self-deporting. I don't know what the percentage will be, but there'll be a lot of people who don't want to deport because they want to apply for legal status. The other problem is public opinion in the supportive communities has radically switched. So where I live, the Mexican-American community traditionally said, if my cousin's friend came from Oaxaca and he's living in the garage behind the house and he's working, that's terrible, racist if you deport him. Now they're saying these people are coming in huge numbers. They're flooding my son's school. They're calling him a gringo because he doesn't speak Spanish. They're taking the dialysis clinic slot that my grandmother has. I just want them to go back. And that's new. So there's no public support for it. 65% want deportations. I think what Trump is going to do very quickly is use iterations. So the first iteration will be those that have broken the law, about 500,000 of them known felons, mostly but not all from Venezuela, Colombia, Central America. And then when those are deported, then it will be the people, the next iteration under Biden. They've only been here for less than 4 years. They have no record of employment and they're on public assistance. That's about 1.5 million. And then they're going to have another iteration. Those who've already been adjudicated, they've already been notified for whatever reason they're subject to immediate deportation. That's another 1.5 million. So after you get rid of about 4.5 million, you still have about 7 or 8 that Biden let in. And that's going to be interesting because you also have another 20 million. So I think the grand bargain that Trump is saying is, if you let me deport all of the people that Biden brought in, even if they're not under criminal suspicion, and even though they're working, and even though they're not on public assistance, then I will start to look at the 5, 10-year, 20-year residents with a possibility of getting a green card. I think that's where but I do think that Trump and his people feel they have public support to deport the 12 million that came in under Biden. And I think the communities here that are constituencies of pro-immigration are not going to say, we need all of these people from mainland China, and we need all these people from Somalia, and we need 50% are not Hispanics. And that's the largest constituency that's always been for open borders. And now all of a sudden, and there's also one final tweak in this argument, and that is Ms. Scheinbaum in Mexico is a hard left communist, and she's been very vocal. And I think there's going to be a lot less sympathy for deportations, opposition to deportations among American residents. When she says, I can't close the border, and people are going to say, you know what, $63 billion is too much for you. In other words, what I'm saying just in conclusion, there are peripheral issues around illegal immigration that people are advancing that the public really is behind. And one of them is we are sending $63 billion to a corrupt Mexican government, another 60 to a corrupt Latin American governments from remittances, and the vast majority of these people who are doing it are A, illegal, and B, on public or local support by us, the taxpayer, that's freeing up their cash to support these corrupt governments of their home. And then second, the latest figures have gone down, but we were up to 80 and 100,000 people killed by fentanyl. It wasn't just, well, they deserved it because they took drugs. These were drugs that were deliberately disguised as Ativan, Valium, less lethal drugs, or even candy or prescriptions. And they were knowingly assembled in Mexican factories by the Mexican government's allowance of Chinese fentanyl to be sent as a raw product and then trafficked across by the cartels. So when you say deportation, Mexico border, half the population says, yeah, and they're ripping us off for billions of dollars in remittances gone from people on welfare, and they're killing us. They've killed more people than we lost in Vietnam and Korea combined, and they do that in a single year. So there's a lot of arguments that have not been adduced before that Trump, he's got a very good team. Tom Homan is very good, and Stephen Miller, the architect of the whole deportation, they're fearless people, and they're immune from the left's usual vitriol.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more content, please subscribe to our new GBN America YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.